Now he's back in a more traditional setting. Tomorrow at London's Phoenix Theatre, Sondheim has his second West End premiere this year with a show called Into the Woods. It's also his second project with the librettist James Lapine. The woods in question are ones occupied by well-known fairy tale figures like Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel and Jack and the Beanstalk. But these characters' adventures come from sources as diverse as the brothers Grimm, child psychologist Bruno Bettelheim and Carl Jung. Stephen Sondheim explains all to Ned Sharon.
You always seem to come out of a different door every time you approach a subject. You seem to have either a different idea or a different approach. Do you see any thematic shape through all your work, or are you conscious of coming out of different tracks?
No, I do see a thematic connection between the last two shows, which I've done with Jim Lapine, and I think that thematic connection comes with him. There are similarities thematically, although not in any other way, between Sunny in the Park with George and Into the Woods. And a lot of it has to do with parent to child, teacher to student, the passing on of knowledge, precepts, and a kind of an emotional circularity that occurs from generation to generation. But we've been very true to the fairy tales.
These have long been, the characters in Into the Woods have long been the sort of stock in trade of English Christmas pantomime. Is there a sense in which they come more surprisingly to American audience? Is it the Bettelheim book which opened up fairy stories, or did
no,
that just a clue
too
for you to...
Too much has been made out of the Bettelheim. As a matter of fact, we read the Bettelheim, but the major research, if any, that we did was just reading all the folk tales from various cultures. And what we did was we consulted with a Jungian analyst on myths and on these particular myths, and that was more influential, I'd say, than Bettelheim. What we did was we looked at the characters very carefully and tried to figure out what they were. We've been very, as I say, true to the tales, but you know, we use, for example, the Grimm version of Cinderella, not the Perrault version. Most people don't know the Grimm version, in which Cinderella goes back to the ball 3 times and has a mystical relationship with birds. And anyway you look at it, the Cinderella tale is a very hard one to figure out, because, you know, you've got a girl who, on the one hand, lives in a house where she's mistreated and ill-used and poor, and then she goes to another house where she meets the handsomest man in the kingdom and the richest, and he wants to marry her. And she can't make up her mind which one she wants. And you think, what is that story about? You know? But you have to look into the psychology of the characters as told in the folk tales, not as interpreted by Bettelheim or Jung or anybody else.
There's a tremendous sense of the musical construction in Sunday in the Park with George, almost a symphonic build and the various things coming to a climax. How do you reconcile the various disparate themes musically in this one?
Well, what I've done with this one is I decided, instead of picking character themes, to take sort of idea themes. For example, it all takes place in the woods, except for the 2 prologues and the 2 acts. And so I have a journeying theme, and I just happen to have it here on the piano. I'll show you what it is. But it's essentially a rhythmic theme. It's not a melodic theme. And it's just kind of skipping through the woods. It opens the show, and we see the various characters. The first 10 minutes is a kind of montage of all the stories that we're going to meet, or most of them anyway. And so it cross-cuts back and forth between them. But underneath it is this relentless rhythm that goes, I wish more than anything, more than life, more than jewels, I wish. And then we go on to another story, and we go through them all. And throughout this entire prologue, though it varies, there are places where the rhythm drops out, you essentially are always getting this slightly off beat. This works throughout the thing, and for example, when it varies when Jack of Jack and the Beanstalk fame and his mother are around, it becomes a waltz rhythm. And as a matter of fact, they've got this cow, which is falling apart, and Jack doesn't want to sell it because the cow is a friend, and so to this rhythm, his mother says, we must sell it, look at her. And she sings. There are bugs on her dugs, there are flies in her eyes, there's a lump on her rump big enough to be a hump. Son, we've no time to sit and dither, while her withers wither, and no one keeps a cow for a friend. And now we cut to Little Red Riding Hood. who is at a house of a baker, and she's about to set off on her journey, and hers goes, into the woods it's time to go, I hate to leave, I have to though. Into the woods it's time, and so I must begin my journey. Into the woods and through the trees to where I am expected, ma'am. Into the woods to grandmother's house. Into the woods to grandmother's house. But you see, the rhythm is constantly going, even if it's in a different meter. So we have the sense of people chugging along on a journey. That's the rhythmic structure that persists throughout the show, and it keeps coming back as the characters go farther and farther into their adventures. But soon, in the prologue, we meet a witch, and suddenly the feeling of the music changes, even though the witch comes in a little slower. And what has been, it's in a different key, what has been going along. When the witch comes in, suddenly turns into something else. Becomes sinister, more accent. And against this, we start to hear a theme while she's talking that goes. So it goes. And that's a melodic theme, and there are 5 notes in it. And the plot concerns 5 magic beans. And each one of those notes represents a bean. And that theme recurs throughout the show, just in various guises. The witch's daughter, who is Rapunzel, sings it as a vocalise. Ah, she's always in her tower singing ah, throughout the show. And it becomes an accompaniment figure at one point for Jack and his cow. And it is used, in fact, it's sort of fun to follow that theme throughout the show. It's used upside down, it's used backwards in many ways. But the 5 beans, every time they have a relevance to the plot, that theme crops up. So we have one rhythmic theme, which is the journey, and one melodic theme, which is the beans. And then I have one harmonic theme, which is the witch's chord when she casts spells, which is this chord. And that construction becomes enormously important. At one point, when she sends the baker out on his task, which is to collect 4 objects in the woods, that chord, in a different position, suddenly starts to take on a harmonic color, and we have the 4 objects going. And those represent the 4 different objects. So that these 3 themes, the melodic one, the rhythmic one, the harmonic one, are the glue that hold the whole show together. And over the evening, what happens is that they begin to take on a resonance in the audience's mind, so that when they hear this chord, even softly, they know something bad is going to happen, or something is going to change. Or when they hear this, they know that somebody's going to come marching on stage. Or when they hear, they know that something with the beanstalk, that also becomes a romantic theme, etc., etc. The point is to give resonance, as well as to give some glue to hold the score together.
The journey for the characters up to the end of Act 1 is purely one of I wish and hoping that they will fulfill. In the second act, disenchantment sets in.
It's not so much disenchantment. What happens is that in order to get their wishes in the first act, they each have to transgress a little bit. Every single one of the characters. I mean, when you look at the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, after all, it's about a boy who goes up to a kingdom. He's taken in by this nice lady giant, given food and shelter. And what does he do? He steals the giant's gold. He goes back a second time, steals the giant's hen. Then it goes back a third time, steals the giant's harp, and this time kills the giant. Mm-hmm. And he's a thief and a murderer. And Cinderella goes to the ball and pretends to be somebody else. That's called lying. And so there's ways of looking at each of these characters has a little transgression, and all their transgressions add up into one huge transgression. And in the second act, it's the consequences of that transgression that arise. What have they brought on themselves? And having discovered what they brought on themselves, which is nothing more nor less than the end of the world, they have to band together and become a community and have some kind of inter-responsibility and not just be each for himself in order to save the world, to put it back together again. I have a song at the end called No One Is Alone that has been criticized for being, a pat and sentimental idea, but it does not mean that no one is alone as opposed to we are all strangers and alone. It means that we are all responsible for each other, that every action we take, from the smallest one, you know, from the tiniest thing you tell your wife or your husband in the morning, has consequences and can spread and you must therefore always be responsible for your actions. And in that sense, it's, you know, as John does, no man is an island, and it's just true. And that's what the second act is about, rather than the Oscar Wilde thing of, you know, the only thing worse than not getting your wish is getting your wish. Well, I paraphrase.
We shall have to trek to the Phoenix Theatre to see whether they get their wish.
I
or
hope
not.
so.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Into the Woods opens tomorrow at the Phoenix Theatre in London.